Buddy.
Hi, John. Gallery view so that, oh, there I can see everybody.
These sessions, I confess, are a little bit early for me, but I persevere. I read this yesterday, and I wanted to reread it this morning, but I didn't have a chance. But I made some notes, and I'll take it from there. We were going to read.
Yeah, I'll need to lead it a little bit early today, just to let you know. So I've passed the hosting to Doug so that you guys don't have to stop when I stop. But
When do you have to leave, Geoffrey?
I have to leave just after 12 my time. So
okay. So we have an hour and a half.
Yeah, we have an hour and a half. Yeah.
Okay, we'll keep it. We'll try to keep it to that manageable. So we were looking at the double bind. And let me see if I can find my book here. We covered schizophrenia, and he also introduces the double bind in previous chapters, but I think this is where he's going more deep into it.
And more general maybe too, right? So he's sort of saying, take it out of the context of schizophrenia and let's look at it in a more general way, right?
Right, and I'm going to quote him, but if I can find I have two copies of this. Both of them are beat up. And I think I'm looking at the wrong copy of my, oh, here it is. I was trying to find out, well, where's the notes I made? Okay, so I think so where is, oh, and here's my copy of Small Arcs. Sorry, I'm a little unorganized here. And we're looking at the zombies in the Hitchhiker, right?
Yep.
And therapy, or poem therapy.
And the Metalogue as well, on how do we know anything?
Right.
How do we know what we know?
Okay. How do we know what we know? Okay. Now, all of this weaves together, I think, really well. We're like halfway through.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm noticing I used the word transcontextual yesterday in one of my posts. It was after that machine learning conversation I had with Doug. And I thought, transcontextual, yes. And I think that comes right out of Bateson, both Nora and Gregory.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the way these kinds of concepts start to become, part of our communicational system. Because she was saying interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary don't work for her anymore. That's why she's come up with this what are we calling it? I'm having a breakdown here. Transcontextual learning. Okay. So it's about context. It's about context, stupid. Pay attention to the context. And I think this is what she's feeling in her own process, and she's exploring this. And I think we're in these kinds of dilemmas. I think they call it aporia in philosophy world, where you're just up against it and you don't know what to do. These impasses, these conflicts, I think these paradoxes. And what do we do when we're getting this feeling that we're in one of these liminal zones where we don't know what to do, and we've run out of gas, and we don't know where if there's a filling station around. I mean, these are things that are happening to us collectively for like the first time, and I think we're paying attention. Many of us are feeling a little anxiety, if not a lot of anxiety, about what happens next. And I think we're registering some of this in our conversations here at Cosmos and conversations we're having elsewhere. And I think that this is why why we need to revisit this particular book, The Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Because this really is, I believe, the launching pad, I'm using a metaphor. How are we going to bring these different styles, actually? I think they're more like, it's a different style of holding paradox and dilemma and conflict than the old style, which is nuke it, shoot it, cut it out, you know, get rid of it. And I think that comes out of that first order cybernetics, which a lot of AI comes out of. And our current AI world is still, I believe, incredibly immersed in that first order, and moving to a second order, where you no longer can easily divide up things in terms of subjects and objects. Observing, I'm the observer, you're the object over there. I study you, I implement certain things in your system, and I extract value from that exercise, to something that's more second order, where we're no longer objective observers, we are participant observers in a system with other participant observers. So communique is not one way, it's moving in many different directions. So I think this is something that he is looking at in this particular chapter. He's elaborating with his moving out of the world of the schizophrenic and the clinic, and moving into working with other intelligent mammals, porpoises. And he gives this wonderful description of a relationship between a trainer and a porpoise. And this is kind of a parable. I'm just going to quote some of the summary, I think, that he comes up with. He's talking about how the animal comes out for performances and pretty much does the same thing. So there's a structure that's been established, a certain context. But in order for each exhibition, each showing to have something new happen, she must break a pattern. And I'm calling the porpoise she. The trainer could be a she also. So the trainer could be creating conditions so that the porpoise is challenged to break the pattern. And so the trainer withholds when the porpoise comes out and does her trick, and she doesn't get the reward that she was expecting, that fish, she flaps her tail. This is an indicator to the trainer that the porpoise is not pleased. And then it goes on from there. And finally, the porpoise learned to deal with the context of context by offering a different or new piece of conspicuous behavior whenever she came on stage. All this had happened in the free natural history of the relationship between porpoise and trainer and audience. The sequence was then repeated experimentally with a new porpoise and carefully recorded. 2 points from this experimental repeat of the sequence must be added. First, that it was necessary in the trainer's judgment to break the rules of the experiment many times. The experience of being in the wrong was so disturbing to the porpoise that in order to preserve the relationship between porpoise and trainer, the context of context, it was necessary to give many reinforcements to which the porpoise was not entitled. In other words, the trainer had to give the porpoise free fish, unearned fish, in order to maintain a relationship with the porpoise. Because the porpoise is just saying, fuck you, I'm not doing anything. So I think this is an important note, that we're stepping outside of that Skinnerian reinforcement kind of learning model. By giving away free food to the animal, you're creating rapport with the animal, and recognition. You're not going to get the animal to cooperate in any kind of learning if you don't have rapport. And then he says, second, each of the first 14 sessions was characterized by many futile repetitions of whatever behavior had been reinforced in the immediately previous session. Seemingly only by accident did the animal provide a piece of different behavior. In the timeout between the 14th and the 15th sessions, the porpoise appeared to be much excited, and when she came on stage for the 15th session, she put on an elaborate performance, including 8 conspicuous pieces of behavior, of which 4 were entirely new, never before observed in the species of the animal. So this is, I think, a clear indication of a breakthrough. And the animal was delighted, and so was the trainer. But the context had been created so that this could happen. And we're noting something was happening that had never happened before. And just like the crow cracking the nut, and this porpoise perhaps doing something before the human population that the humans had never seen this behavior in a porpoise before. These are indications of something new in the cosmos. And this is, I think, something that we should all celebrate and continue to persevere in. How do we create conditions for these kinds of breakthroughs to happen? And finally, he says, this story illustrates, I believe, 2 aspects of the genesis of a transcontextual syndrome. So we're sort of going back to schizophrenia land. That severe pain and maladjustment can be induced by putting a mammal in the wrong regarding its rules for making sense of an important relationship with another mammal. And second, that if this pathology can be warded off or resisted, the total experience may promote creativity. So we can have minds that can pathologize. We can have minds that can create innovation, something new. And so I believe we're in this delicate balance. And I believe the recognition of this delicate balance is what the ecological mind is all about, rather than I'm going to make a cookie cutter stamp of everything around me so that I can maintain this pseudo stability. And so we're going to keep on using fossil fuels. We're going to keep on putting insecticides that kill birds, that kill insects, that kill our crops. You know, we're going to keep on doing this behavior simply because it's what has been done. And, you know, I don't want to be put into a situation where I don't know all the answers to everything. So I think this tendency is getting exacerbated by our use of computers by some persons, certainly not all. Hopefully we're creating conditions for using this technology in innovative ways so that we can create relationships and start to appreciate different points of view, holding that delicate balance and dealing with our minds and perhaps double binds, which we did not produce as individuals. These are collectively produced and widely shared. So I'm just going to quote our friend Douglas, because we had this conversation yesterday, and I believe it's sort of I think it captures, I believe, some of these Batesonian principles we're trying to put into our practice here. We were talking about machine learning, and there were some strong differences expressed. I objected to the metaphor, machine learning. I saw it as a misleading metaphor. And we talked about the difference between biotic and abiotic systems, and how I believe that sometimes that gets confused, that with the repetition of this machine learning metaphor, we are forgetting and leaving aside the complexities of those biotic systems, like ourselves, which are driven by aesthetic principles. So I think and I'll quote you here, at the end of the conversation, Douglas says, I don't know what to say. I don't think I necessarily learned too much, other than in this conversation, I appreciate others' ability to articulate their point of view. I think that is a trait that I am working on. We're all on the same page here. If we want best practice, we need better principles. And those principles are inside the mind of people like us, coming out slowly. My computer won't say this, nor the human mind. That's the beginning. I'm paraphrasing you here, Doug. I don't get the exact words. We talk about that aesthetic drive and humans, and there are hundreds of human drives which can pollute that aesthetic drive. And you're going to say, I don't know what machine learning means anymore. It is an even bigger mess. Thinking, knowing. I don't know anything. And that's a good place to start. So I feel that instead of wilting in disappointment, I was like, yes, I don't know where to start. That's a good place to start. So I think we have another parable here. We have the parable of the porpoise, and now we have the parable of Doug and his coming to terms with, well, he's questioning and this metaphor. And I believe I'm questioning the metaphor too. I don't have an answer. But I'm also proposing, let's not rush to premature cognitive commitment about something that could lead us very seriously astray. And I believe that we do need to find a way in this technological civilization. I think Dave Orloffler's promoting. How do we make that happen if we don't know the difference between abiotic systems and biotic systems? The algorithmic drive behind much AI can actually violate the biotic, the analogical. And we are analogical and digital. We have both of those capacities. And how are we going to find a way of using both of these capacities in this delicate balancing act we have to pull off with our own human nature and with the animal nature and the other intelligences that are on this planet. All of them are trying to make sense in their unique way. So I hope this conversation continues to open up these possibilities that I think Nora very poetically offers, and what Bateson, in a slightly different register, I think, is trying to do as well. But just one more thing I'm going to add to this, and I'm sort of cheating here because I'm fast forwarding into the next chapter, where he's talking about the different levels of learning, all of which, by the way, Doug, if we parsed the structure of your communique at the end of our conversation, there are many levels. I'm listening for them, and I think you were aware that you were moving between levels. And that's where we get in those tangles, is when we're moving between levels, or we're staying in one level, and we're trying to apply one level of learning to contexts that those learnings don't work in. So I think we should, that's maybe a homework assignment for both of us, is to, like, okay, when we have a bind, can we slow things down, pay really exquisite attention to the different levels that people are using and they're revealing in their language. And just to add to this, he adds, I think, in this next chapter, he talks about the Deutero-Learning, the different levels of learning. He's talking about the von Neumann players. This sort of sounds like an early video game, and the choices that are given to the player. And he's just saying how different that kind of learning is from what's happening with an organism. He says the discovery in this von Neumann player, among the options that the player has, when more information becomes available, the player may discover that a move was wrong, but this discovery can contribute nothing to his future skill. By definition, the player used correctly all the available information. He estimated the probabilities correctly and made the move which was most probably correct. The discovery that he was wrong in the particular instance can have no bearing upon future instances. When the same problem returns at a later time, he will correctly go through the same computations and reach the same decision. Moreover, the set of alternatives among which he makes his choice will be the same set, and correctly so. In contrast, an organism is capable of being wrong in a number of ways of which the player is incapable. These wrong choices are appropriately called error. When they are of such a kind, they would provide information to the organism which might contribute to his future skill. These will all be cases in which some of the available information was either ignored or incorrectly used. Various species of such profitable error can be classified. And he goes on to do that. But I just wanted to point out that he's wrestling with this first order cybernetics, what many are calling, I think, machine learning, that metaphor. And he's looking at organismic learning and how they're different. And as we start to mature in our use of these machines, we can debate their ontological status if some people want to do that. But I just say, you know, let's press the pause button and get really clear about the organismic and the biotic and the rhythmic and the 24-hour cycles and the peristalsis and the what's in our gut, digesting our food. This is all biotic. And I believe the algorithmic drive that's running a lot of the so-called machine learning is driven by this global imaginary, which is not the same thing as the planetary imaginary that I think Bateson is trying to articulate. Anyway, that's just some of the big trends for me. It's always an adventure rereading this stuff because each time you go through it, something new starts to pop up, and hopefully that gets integrated into new behaviors. Thank you. And just so I open up this floor, I'm curious about what you guys are picking up on.
I don't mind starting with the I don't know comment and reflecting on that and bringing it forward. So this will be on the personal level and the ability to articulate. So I mentioned in that cafe as the individual kind of putting together these cafes on a weekly basis, I feel a certain need to articulate what needs to happen or the direction, the questions to ask. So in that conversation, which wasn't stated so clearly, because in my personal context, it makes so much sense here, but to translate that into the written context, let alone into the dialogue that follows that's so unpredictable. Essentially, what my mind wanted was to take machine learning and just simply come up with a term that maybe it would be machine computing or machine processing or something like that. And so during that conversation, I was very frustrated. I was angry, which silence is usually the way I respond. So I didn't talk too much. And at the end, my response was based on kind of this angry cloud that was there, that had formed throughout the conversation, based on this cloud that was maybe 1/4 of what I had intended, and that's always floating around. But for it to rain down onto the page, it's an impossibility. So yeah, I don't know, like I mentioned in that conversation, exactly what I know. I don't know. And right now is a prime example too of when you were talking, there were at least 6 or 7 points I wanted to make. I wanted to connect Nora Bateson's therapy poem, which it's hard to, on the surface, to see what she means by therapy in that poem. And perhaps my one way of looking at it is there's this comfort in not knowing, or she's seeking this. It's okay to not know. It's a natural process. It's part of existing in these context upon context upon context, that once you situate yourself into one context, you're automatically neglecting the millions of other contexts. As you noted, in that conversation, I said, well, there's, the abiotic, the biotic, but even our messy biotic, or it was the aesthetics. We were concluding that aesthetics, art, and we've mentioned here, poetry is hones in on what we humans are all about, but at the same time, our biological drives, all other human processes or human context from the cellular level. You've been looking at biosemiotics all the way to something like ecosemiotics, which I've yet to read about, but so it's tough to know where to proceed. And those that can articulate it, those that have more experience, whether because of age or the two of you here have read Gregory Bateson, so I see you two as helping me to translate the Batesonian context. I appreciate you bringing that up then.
I just want to add something very briefly. And you mentioned an angry cloud, and that there were 6, and I think it was around your head, and there were 6 or 7 points that you wanted to make, and you wanted to connect with what Nora is calling therapy, and what the comfort of not knowing, and the messy biotic, and aesthetics, art, and poetry, and biological drives. And those who can articulate and help you translate. And with all of that, what happens to that angry cloud?
Right. It's so a little context. The cloud was actually, I think Bateson in his Metalogue calls it the fog. So that fog, he divides up, saying, well, you obviously can't divide it up. He says, that's fog that I made for myself when I was trying to think. So that angry cloud at that point has shifted into, it disperses like the weather. There's no fog right now.
Oh.
So it comes and goes like weather patterns, I suppose.
So it's like weather patterns, and it comes and goes. And as a person who shares with you moments of confusion and bafflement, it's really good for me to know that if I sense that Doug has an angry cloud descending around his head, it's not directed at me. He has a right to this angry cloud, which can then disperse, just like the weather, so that we can appreciate this in our relational field. Because we all are communicating to one another many different states of mind and body, and some of those may be contracted, some of those may be expansive, some of them may be contracted and expansive at the same time. And I believe it's a real challenge, since we're not in the same room, in the same physical location, in this technology, to have that kind of awareness, that meta-awareness. And I believe that's what this book is all about, is how do we metacognize without dissociating, so that we can also appreciate that somatic intelligence, but that we can bring them both together as we communicate from these sometimes very confused states of body-mind. But rather than, oh, that person's confused and that's confusing me, let's get them out of that stuck state as soon as possible. Let's give them drugs. We may have to take them off the playground because they can't play with other kids. We'll have to isolate them and study them I think those kinds of tendencies tend to freeze our symptoms, and they don't get a chance to complete. The circuit of learning is interrupted and doesn't get a chance to complete itself. So instead of letting the child cry and be confused, we go over there and scoop it up and try to comfort it. Come on, stop crying. And then I think that the child or the adult even starts to lose that capacity for, oh, okay, if I stay with this angry cloud will disperse, just like bad weather, and something else can come forward. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to sort of play around with our discourse event in a very direct way. So I think this is part of our becoming meta-aware. Thank you. Geoffrey, I'm looking forward to hearing what you're coming up with.
So I'm going to play around. So
as long as I get some unearned fish, that's fine with me.
Well, we'll see. You'll have to tell me whether you get any unearned fish. So I've been working on this book project with my colleague and friend Jocelyn, who you've met through some of the other discussions. And the book project, I think I've mentioned it before. It concerns, it's a book about singularity. So it's an attempt to grapple with the issue of singularity. And it's related to your discussion on machine learning, which I tried to get to but wasn't able to yesterday. Because, in fact, part of the book on singularity is an argument against this obsession with algorithmic-based learning, because the thing about, so singularity, when we talk about singularity, we don't mean the technological singularity discussed by Kurzweil and Vinge. We're talking about singularity in the sense of behavior or points or loci where predictable or determinate behavior breaks down, or where things go unique in a way that they cannot be taken out of their uniqueness, right? So this is a kind of the two understandings of singularity as a kind of uniqueness and as a non-determination actually related to each other. And so we're exploring these issues. And the thing about, so we've looked into philosophers, how they discuss singularity. There's not a lot in the philosophy world about this, but some of the key thinkers have talked about it. In particular, Gilles Deleuze has talked about it, and Jacques Derrida has talked about it, and in a somewhat different way, although complementary way between the two of them. And the idea, so they talk about essentially singularities of being in an ontology of being, right? So as opposed to the mathematicians or the physicists who, when they talk about singularities, they're talking about formal singularities in a theoretical kind of sense, right? So, and there's a difference between the singularities in being and the singularities in mathematics and physics, which are to some extent fictive or theoretical rather than real, right? Whereas the singularities of being are real, but they're in a different way. And so the argument against machine learning is that algorithms don't deal with singularities. They in fact, you cannot construct an algorithm because an algorithm works off generalities in order to function. And it doesn't know how to deal with the specificities and the non-determination of singularity. Whereas being is shot, so you could have this idea that a single person is singular, but the way the philosophers talk about it is a being is full of different singularities, many different kinds of singularities that are all operating. And in a way, Bateson's double bind is an example of a singularity in a psychological way, right? So because people get stuck inside the double bind. That's why it's called a double bind, because no matter what you do, you can't just simply get out of it in any straightforward way. The only way out of a double bind, as we've seen, is through an act of creativity. Otherwise, you stay stuck in it. And creativity is the thing that algorithms don't do well, right? There's no, so to some extent, now, I'm worried about the discussion in academia about machine learning, because it seems like if you read the literature that many of the proponents of this thing think this is actually going to work like human beings do, which is, to me, so totally
stupid,
ridiculous. But it is a kind of seductive idea that is in circulation. I actually think there are probably a lot more people like me, even in the science world, who don't buy into this argument, but who are not vocal right now because the dominant discourse is about this idea. And so those of us who don't go along with it are kind of thinking it through and coming up with arguments to, so this is a kind of an argument against this. But so, I mean, ultimately, I think it's doomed to fail as an enterprise. The problem, of course, is it will tie up resources in a massive way to do something which is ultimately doomed to fail. And that's worrisome, because as we've seen with the sort of ambient culture that we've got, the enrichment of the culture is declining because of this resources that are focused into the algorithmic world, right? So it's not you can't just say, oh, well, it's doomed to fail, so I don't have to worry about it. You have to worry about it because it's taking up so many of our human resources. So there is that issue. But so it's a kind of a long-winded thing around this, but I do think the double bind is a perfect example of one of these things that is not well dealt with algorithmically, and that human beings, I mean, the more you look at double binds, the more they are everywhere, right? In the way Bateson describes them, right? And the other thing I wanted to do, it's another segue kind of tangential thing, is I promised to look up a couple of issues. So I promised to look up the issue of phenome and genome and the relationship between the two, which I did. And I also wanted to look up, because in his article, in that article on double bind, hang on, I think I can find it. Bateson says, geneticists have paid very little attention to the necessity of defining the logical typing of messages carried by DNA, in parentheses. And I thought, oh, this is written in the 1940s, 50s. Surely something's been done since then. So I looked it up, and I'm able to respond to what has been done since, which isn't a lot. But there is some work on it. So if I go to my notes. So to go back to the genome and the phenome. So the idea of remember the argument of the genome versus the phenome is that genes direct everything. That the phenome, which is the way an organism develops from birth through life to death, so the stuff that happens after birth, if you like, does not influence the genome, but the genome influences the phenome, right? So that the gene structure, the DNA structure, determines things about what happens to the individual, but the individual does not determine anything that happens in the genome. And this is Darwin's idea. And Lamarck, who I thought was well, he is a kind of contemporary of Darwin, but it actually precedes Darwin slightly in time. Lamarck had this idea that no individuals and their decisions and what happens to individuals can affect the genome. And there was this big, long discussion about it that lasted almost a century. And scientists massively decided as a group that Lamarck was wrong and Darwin was right. And so even since then, this idea that the genome determines the phenome is being the dominant one in science. Only lately it has been started to question. So I found a quote. Which I thought was interesting. Oh yeah, here's a quote from somebody called Weiss. The Phylogenetic Logic of Life, which is 2005. For nearly a century, we have understood that life works through genes, and so have had an elegant theory for general evolution, but this did not explain the kinds of traits that characterize organisms, nor how genes produce them. Advances in recent decades have opened the way for an understanding of the phylogenetic logic. No, that's not what I wanted. Oh, here it is. Sorry, Newman and Batts, 2011. The article is called Lamarck's Dangerous Idea. The scientific ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, so his life was 1744 to 1829, are re-entering the discourse of biology after nearly a century of marginalization and opprobrium. Partly this is due to increased recognition of discordances between genotype and phenotype in a wide variety of organisms. So the idea here is that if genotype determines phenotype, then you should not have a huge variety of phenotype for the same genotype, where in fact you do. So genotype cannot determine completely phenotype, right? In many cases, organisms with given genotypes assume different phenotypes under different conditions. This presents a problem for the standard model of evolution, the Darwinian modern synthesis. If the variant phenotypes are not found to be manifestations of evolved alternative programs, but instead due to the inherent plasticity of any material system. So again, the idea is that phenotypical systems in nature are highly plastic, and as a result, the plasticity is as much a function of phenotype as it is of genotype. And as a result, there's a certain feedback between the two. Such phenomena are part of Lamarck's, but not Darwin's theoretical framework. End of quote from this particular text. And another thing that by serendipity, I was listening to a radio broadcast yesterday on CBC, Canadian radio, which was talking about a recent work on sleep, which of course I was interested in because of my problems with sleep. But it was a study that, it was a really interesting study. It was a scientific study of the zebrafish. And what is interesting about the zebrafish is that it is transparent. So they can study what goes on in the brain in the living animal by looking in and seeing the dynamics of what's going on inside the brain at the cellular level, which is impossible, of course, with human brains. You can see neurological activity through electrical activations using electrical methods. That's what brain scanning is all about, or through chemical mechanisms. But you can't actually see at the cellular level what's going on, whereas in the zebrafish you can. And so I'll just read the abstract from I found the paper. Sleep is essential to all animals with a nervous system. Nevertheless, the core cellular function of sleep is unknown, and there is no conserved molecular marker to define sleep across phylogeny. So there's no general understanding of sleep across all the different animals, but there's an assumption that there is a generality across that. Time-lapsing image of chromosomal markers in single cells of live zebrafish revealed that sleep increases chromosome dynamics in individual neurons. Manipulation of sleep chromosome dynamics, neuronal activity, and DNA double-strand breaks. So double-strand breaks are a kind of damaged DNA that happens on a regular basis all the time. But what they showed is that that the chromosome activity in these fish increases during sleep and repairs the DNA breakages. Whereas in the daytime, it's not, because the chromosomal activity is lower, because the energy requirements for doing that are being taken up by other activities. And so the DNA is not repaired fast enough. It's damaged faster than it's repaired. But at night, during sleep, it's repaired faster than it's damaged. And so the sleep appears to correct these damages at the DNA level. And now this is a direct example of phenotype affecting genotype. Not so much in recoding, but in repairing. It's a very interesting reverse of the thing. So this is an example of a kind of double bind effect, or a logical typing effect anyway, in the genome, right? Which is related to what we were talking about. In terms of the question about logical typing, there are a number of papers in the last 2 decades that deal with logical typing in the genome, but they're very, very sparse. And there's a book that was done called, hang on, I've got it here, A Legacy for Living Systems in 2008, which is a kind of post-Batesonian look at genetics using Bateson's ideas. It's a compendium of articles by different scientists, all brought together to look at the Batesonian argument around this. But it's the only significant set of articles in one location. Otherwise, there are a few scattered pieces where people say, well, we need to look at this. Bateson talked about it, and nobody's really done anything on it. So, so it's a separate thing. I did want to say a couple of other things. I mean, this discussion you were just having about, when I was first reading Bateson as a young man, I was good friends with a woman who was schizophrenic, diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so I had a number of discussions with her about Bateson's work on schizophrenia. And we agreed that this idea of she was on medication, and she believed, so we had some discussions about medication, and she believed, and I've heard this from other people too, that the medication is useful for allowing a person to function, because there's the issue of functioning in everyday society. And if you've got severe schizophrenia, or even moderate schizophrenia, you can't actually function in society. And so the medication gives a way to manage one's life and function. But she was also very aware that it was not necessarily the long term, that it wasn't really addressing the issues in it. And of course, the family issues were also very relevant. She was living at home, and the family dynamics were clearly schizophrenic as well in this context. So they were being maintained she was being maintained in this situation through the family dynamics as well. So it was a very it modulated my understanding of Bateson by pointing out that even though the medication is not always that the current approach, which medicates everything without first and then ask questions afterwards, is not always the great approach. But you can't just turn away the medication and say you just do it the other way, because the problem is people have to live and operate in their lives, and the medication helps them do that. So it's a complicated question, and there aren't any fast and easy answers to those kinds of issues. Nora Bateson, in her article, she talks about the difficulty. So I thought it was interesting because we had her article about her father crying at the bus stop the previous time, about sending Nora off to the education system. And now we have an anecdote about Nora sending her son off to the education system with a very similar kind of reaction going on. So, hi, Adam. Wow.
Hello. Hi, Adam. Welcome.
Welcome. I'll finish up my point and then maybe we'll come back to so Nora and she said how something about how the education system, how when you criticize the education system, you're always marginalized by the education system itself. And I thought, oh, I can relate to that. This describes my current anguish around the education system, because of course, most of my comments about the educational system to the education system itself are critical, and I'm certainly being on the marginalized side as a result of those comments. So, so I'm sorry it's a bit scattered what I said.
I thought it was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to make a... Doug, did you want to chime in? I found some lovely little nuggets there that I want to...
I've got quite a few too, but you
go
go
for
on.
it. You go.
I'll try my best to... I think I mentioned before that Adam was one that kind of picked out individual tidbits from everybody around the circle and articulated it very well. So hopefully I can do that articulating here. So there was quite a bit said there, and previously when you were talking about Lamarck's, the article Lamarck's Dangerous Idea, you stated, Geoffrey, that it reached the conclusion that there's more feedback between the two, the phenome and the genome, than was previously thought. And maybe that's what I wish to articulate with machine learning, that it's not maybe the utopian mentality or the doomsday scenario takes it in one direction, but I mentioned previously, maybe 2 weeks ago, the book Far-Sighted by Stephen Johnson, which he doesn't talk too much about machine learnings or algorithms, but he does note that educational institutes, those involved with predicting climate change, it was about mapping and predicting and deciding about our future. And machine learning, or machine algorithm computational power, is able to be utilized. There's, of course, not the level of creativity that we have, but it can perform mechanical operations into our futures, which we can take or leave. A lot of it is going to be hit or miss, but as we develop better as humans develop better interaction with the machine learning process, we're able to, okay, well, yeah, now we can see that there's 1/4 of the reef dying. Now we can see that if 99% of the reef dies, that the ocean ecosystem will die out. We won't be able to eat fish. Thus, half the world will be not be able to survive unless they're imported food or something like that. So that's a good use of machine learning there. So I just wanted to note that the feedback between the two is maybe where my articulation wanted to head. So that's the conversation I feel we should have. Like, so we know machines are not creative, but in a way, there is the perception that we note that we typically do not hold here, other than maybe on a minor level, but not as our ultimate goal. Others are perceiving that machine learning algorithms are creative enough, and we can rely on them to a certain extent. And that's the talk we need to have. So if all others are perceiving it as creative enough, or that it knows enough, or then it begins to influence our decisions, and that's the problem. Also, you mentioned the sleeping zebrafish and how it regenerates damaged DNA chromosomes. And if I was to play around, I did my hibernation project that I'm working on in the background, which I haven't worked on, but for a few months now. But this is one of those ideas of the Arctic ground squirrel, if I remember correctly, essentially is in a frozen state, in a frozen hibernation state for maybe 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and its brain shuts down. The connections between the synapses are severed, almost to the point that it would be brain dead, but something in its system wakes it up every 2 or 3 weeks in order for it to reconnect the brain. So it's essentially building a new brain, and it goes throughout this process as it's able. I think it starts in like September when the deep freeze comes, and then maybe in April or May, whenever it's able to actually go out and search for food, it has a new brain of some sort. So that's a very interesting concept, and that's being used for Alzheimer research to determine if not if we can deep freeze people and then create a new brain, but the processes that go on, if that's able to perhaps alter the effects of aging and Alzheimer's and other diseases related to that. So yeah, that's very interesting. So in my hibernation project, I'm thinking we personally can do that to a certain extent, whether with technology or not, but that's another story. And it also reminded me of Gebser, this concept of feedback between the two. That or the phenome and the genome. And so if we go into consciousness, we have these kind of set structures that we're stuck in, or currently we're universally mostly within the mental structure. But by knowledge of other forms of consciousness, or reading Gebser, or reading about ways to seek knowledge or something outside of the mental capacities, allows for a full, more integral approach. So I don't know how that actually ties in, but much more to say. I'll go to you, John.
Oh, I thought I'd just say something, a couple of things about what you were saying, Doug. So I probably need to be clear. I'm not arguing against all forms of machine intelligence as an aid to what's going on. Obviously, machine intelligence, the way it's currently being set up, even in its limitations, still has utility. to a variety of cases. And it's, again, serendipity, but yesterday I attended a focus group discussion around a master's thesis project, which is looking at using a virtual musical clavier keyboard to help patients with Alzheimer's, to directly link to your comment, Doug, improve their, or slow down the degradation in terms of creativity, and using music as a way of doing that. So, and algorithmic, an algorithmic interface. So it's not always, it's just that the pundits have these claims about what machine intelligence will do, which are over the moon compared to what I think is actually likely. So that's kind of the argument. The other thing I wanted to say, which I forgot to say it's more of the serendipity. So I was reading I actually had it open for a little while, but I had stopped reading, and I went back to read the March issue of Scientific American Mind. And it was so there was the paper I think I mentioned, there was the article in there that I mentioned on the illusion of consciousness. I think I which I actually find interesting, but there's an article in relation to this issue of Alzheimer's and algorithms of creativity, because there's a discussion about the cognition of the neuroscience of creativity in the same issue of Scientific American Mind. But there was also an article which I found interesting called "The Hippies Were Right, It's All About Vibrations, Man," which is a paper it's an article by somebody named Tam Hunt and his or her collaborator is somebody named Jonathan Schooler at University of California, Santa Barbara. And it's a suggestion that this idea of consciousness as being a kind of synchronicity or a synchronous process, things that happen at the same time in the brain, and that it's all about vibrations. Well, I mean, this is not new as an idea, but what is interesting about the idea that they present is that they draw on Chardin's idea that mind is built into the matter from the bottom up, and that what makes mind work is resonances in structural context. Complex structures create resonances between the micro bits of mind in each bit of matter, which combine together to make the emergence of mind. So it's very much the Chardin idea of the mind being actually built into matter from the bottom up. But it's I'm sure there are other scientific papers that have that approach, but it's the first one I've actually seen it stated so boldly that they have this idea. They don't actually refer to Chardin in the text, but to me the link is pretty obvious. So anyway, I thought it was kind of interesting in this discussion about mind, double mind, and algorithms, in a sense, that here's an approach that has this kind of organic, this separation between what goes on in being and what goes on in algorithms, right? So again, it's, anyway, I find it interesting. Sorry. Another slightly disjointed intervention.
just wanted to note that Antonio Damasio, I think, essentially does the same thing with a book called The Self Comes to Mind, and his latest one is more focused on from develops more into systems theory. I think Michael, who frequents Michael Stumpf, who's on the Cosmos Cafe and the website, he's read that book. But yeah, I like that connection there. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, I could respond, but I also want to invite Adam, if he wanted to join our conversation in any way he wanted to. Wherever you want to start, Adam, just chime right in.
Yeah, sure. I'm in a bit of a noisy cafe, which is why I've got the mute on when I'm not talking. First of all, did I get the start time right?
I think you're a little late. I think our chime, it's 10:30 Eastern Standard Time. I don't know what it is for you in UK, but I think there was a change in the...
Well, it's because we changed times, and the UK hasn't changed time, so there's a
I see.
5-hour difference between the two countries right now.
Okay, so okay, so until our clocks change, it's an hour early. Okay, I'll bear that in mind. So, am I correct with regards to the readings for this week being how much do you know? And
yeah,
okay. So well, first of all, I just provide a bit of feedback on points that came to mind with respect to what Doug said, and with respect to what you said, Geoffrey. Stephen Johnson. Yeah, nothing much to say. I've read one of his books, quite good. Sleeping zebrafish, but that's really fascinating. With regards to Alzheimer's and musical, it's just interesting because in the course of my work, I recently met someone who is setting up a social enterprise, working using. I think what they're doing is quite unique, and I want to look into it more. But what they're trying to do is to use the sort of historic association that older people have with particular music, older people with Alzheimer's, to get them to sort of get them to behave, to get them to perform certain actions that they need to perform. So it's interesting. It could, I guess, it could be perceived as being manipulative in this, but I would certainly. It's a form of manipulation that I think, if so, I think it's a form of manipulation that can be justified on human grounds. I just sent you a link to that. Check that out. That's Memory Tracks by a guy called Gordon Anderson, who created that. With regards to your point about the emergent quality of matter, who was it, Geoffrey, who you said came up with that idea?
So it was an article in Scientific American Mind by Tam Hunt, who named collaborator Jonathan Scooter. But I also referred to Teilhard de Chardin's work as well as background.
Oh, Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah.
That just, I think I mentioned The Ghost in the Machine by Arthur Koestler in the previous call I managed to make on. Koestler makes similar arguments, I think, in Ghost in the Machine. And so I've got some feedback with regards to the active sections. So how much do you know? So it seems to me that this section is about, part of it is about helping us to recognize the implicit metaphors in our language. And that seems to be a theme of the whole book. It's certainly a theme that he introduces in the introduction, because obviously the term much implies that knowledge can be quantified in a linear way. And then the point about the steam engine, somebody else had to think of something before anybody else could make a steam engine. That points to the insight that knowledge and understanding is not a set linear quantity. It's better understood in terms of relationship. It's never a fixed quantity. It's always in a sort of state of dynamic change. With regards to the two facts, bring two facts together to get four, this reminds me a bit about the field of combinatorial creativity, which is a branch of artificial intelligence. And they look specifically at the ways in which new ideas can be generated using artificial intelligence simply by combining existing ideas. And I think it's also something I want to look into a bit more at some point. I think it's also a theory of creativity that has been posited, that creativity can be largely understood simply by combining ideas. I very much recommend the documentary Everything is a Remix. Excellent documentary that I would totally recommend everyone reading. It's explicitly about the issue of copyright law and the concept of intellectual property, but alongside that, it also teaches you loads about the concept of creativity itself. So, yeah, Everything is a Remix. Big recommendation to that. And I think I'll leave it at that because I managed to take a look at the social planning and the concept of Deutero-Learning, but not. But I just wanted to I just want to share one other source of information that I've been talking to people about today, and that's a book by a guy called Thomas W. Malone, who works at the MIT Center of Creative Intelligence. He's written a book called Superminds, The Surprising Power of People and Communities Thinking Together. And I haven't read the book, but I'm planning to. And, I'm planning to listen to it on Audible. But that's a link to the book. And I heard him speak at an event in London. Obviously, he's an American. Well, he's an American, but they flew him over to speak in London at the end of last year. And I think it's grounded in a lot of empirical research. So I think it's a book worth looking at for anyone interested in the field of collective intelligence. So that's my bit.
Thank you. Thank you. Supermind, actually, I don't know if it's related to Andy Clark wrote a book called Supermind, which is not so much collective intelligence as the argument that intelligence isn't just in the brain, but it's in the environment brain circuit, as so it maybe is a complementary argument to the one about collective intelligence. The other thing I wanted to pick up, Adam, when you talk about language, so I went back when I was reading this article on double bind. I'd read it through and I thought about it, and I went back, and I think there's a key passage in this thing that is absolutely critically important, and which is neglected by a lot of people who talk about context. And so Bateson says, psychologists commonly speak as if the abstractions of relationship, dependency, hostility, love, etc., were real things which are to be described or expressed by messages. This is epistemology backwards. In truth, the messages constitute the relationship, and words like dependency are verbally coded descriptions of patterns immanent in the combination of exchanged message. In a sense, he's saying context is generated by the message. It's not that the message sits inside a context. It is the context itself is implicit in the message. So I've seen a lot of attempts to sort of characterize context by looking outside of messages. And this suggests this is doomed to fail too, that you can't do that, that you have to look inside the message to see the context. So surely, I thought this was...
But surely they're not mutually contradictory. I would have thought both can be true, and that both almost certainly are true, and that we're going to get the closest, best perspective on reality if we consider both possibilities and the ways in which they could intersect and interrelate.
Agreed. In fact, the double bind idea is that, you know, how you have a higher level contradicting a lower level, and so that in itself is also a reference outside the message. So, in order to get a double bind. So thank you. Very interesting comments, and I'll certainly make note of the. So the issue of memory tracks.
I could say a little bit about that. May I? Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. I've worked a lot with the elderly, people with Alzheimer's, and it seems that there's no medical intervention, no pharmacological intervention. Certainly, computers are of no use whatsoever. But relationships have a very positive impact on this particular population. And the quality of those relationships have an enormous beneficial effect. If you're paying attention to somebody and you care about them, they are different than if they're plopped in front of a TV screen or a flat screen on a computer. Or if you play music that they were familiar with. I think that was mentioned by Adam when they were young. You'll see, you know, these 90-year-olds, they'll jump up out of their wheelchairs and they'll start spinning, run each other around the room, which is quite a beautiful thing to witness. And I just am reminded of, we're talking about memory and what memory is, or where memory comes from, and the DNA and RNA and the digital code inside of a cell, and the analogical behavior of the cell as it interprets and reads that code, how the analogical and the digital are really, you know, very deep in us. And I think we were talking yesterday with our friend Lisa, who knows a lot about logic and topology. We've had a lot of conversations about topology. And I think this is the challenge about, we live in different worlds. We're analogical and we're digital. And these are two very different ways of operating. And the digital is great because it is a great code for memory. But it's really lousy at predicting what's going to happen next. You need a living organism in an environment with a brain and a body in an environment to make sense. So the living body is pivotal and largely driven by the analogical. And that's, I think, what's being left out of this whole machine learning metaphor. I think every metaphor, of course, can be useful. It can also be distorted. It can distort things. And I think, what is learning? Who is learning? Consciousness, intelligence, knowing. All this vocabulary we're batting around, it's pretty loose. And a lot of it is very fancy. And that's why I like blow the whistle when I hear machine learning, because I believe it's collapsing concepts and making things much murkier and muddier and messier than they really need to be. So I think the next chapter, Bateson gets into the cybernetic self and what the self is and what that personal pronoun I, what could that possibly be for a machine? And the whole idea of final causes and telos and purpose. This is something that I hesitate to go where angels fear to tread, as Bateson used to say, but whereabouts is this machine? Where is this machine's future? And this machine has no DNA or RNA. It has no felt sense of anything, and it never will have any felt sense of anything. This is a gigantic confusion, I think. My theory is it comes from a very adolescent male brain. This whole idea that you can create machines that are going to do your homework for you. And I think we're going to have to mature, and I believe Bateson was the pioneer here. How do we